Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors and contributors of Strategy Page discuss current events and other military-related topics with a splash of history. I'm your host, Dan Masterson. Joining us today is Jim Dunnigan, editor of Strategy Page, well-known military author, and acknowledged pioneer and innovator in board war games. Also joining us today is Austin Bay, associate editor of Strategy Page, military author, columnist, and retired Colonel, U.S. Army Reserves. Good morning. If Taiwan was to be attacked by China, Jim, how would the Chinese do it?
With great difficulty. The Taiwanese have been improving their defenses for the last, especially the last few years. They recently changed their draft law so the troops stay in longer and they're trained in infantry tactics. They also they're going to start, establishing a trained reserve. Again, like Ukraine did. Now, how much time they're going to have, I don't know. But see, the biggest problem China has is if they attack Taiwan, it's a high risk, low payoff, situation. First of all, it's difficult. Despite being an island, there are only about 14 beaches you can land on. So that reduces the number of beaches the Taiwanese have to watch. They also have, the Taiwanese have a lot of missiles. They also have, anti-ship missiles, especially. But they also have airfields that are based on the reverse slope of the many mountains that comprise Taiwan. So they've been preparing for a Chinese attack. Now, the Chinese apparently are still planning on using over 1,000 short-range ballistic missiles. Now that's a half an airstrike, but the Taiwanese have known about that for over a decade, and they've been preparing to basically survive that as best they can. The United States has also adjusted its strategy. The biggest problem the United States has, ironically, is they don't have enough Chevron, fuel and other supply ships to support a major fleet operation in that part of the Pacific. Now, that's a problem we've had for years. In peacetime, it's not so much of a problem because you can always hustle back to one of our many bases in the area. But the Chinese also have to face the fact that if the Americans get in trouble, the South Koreans and the Japanese will get involved or are likely to get involved. Now, China is already threatening the South Koreans. South Korea doesn't have much to fear from the North Koreans anymore, but they also have the Chinese to worry about, and the Chinese basically got very upset when the South Koreans started improving their anti-missile capabilities, because that's apparently where the Chinese missiles are aimed these days. So China right now is in a big problem economically, in terms of working age population. The population is shrinking. They have not implemented a lot of the reforms they've been meaning to do for years. For example, they meant even before COVID, they were working on establishing a true nationwide healthcare system, which would have been invaluable, in COVID. That's why they took strenuous efforts to prevent the spread. Now, they lied about that. And now they can't lie about the latest outbreak, which is the lower lethality, but, quick, faster spreading version, which is basically, let me put it this way. Their exports to the United States were down 20% versus the past year, mainly because of, shutdowns. Exports to the United States. These were basically shut down because the Chinese had, not nationwide, but city by city, region by region, trying to stamp out the new strain of COVID, which, again, they don't have protection from. They refuse to accept Western antivirals, COVID vaccines, because, hey, we're Chinese. But the ones they do are not very effective at all. Indeed, the story was, and it's probably true, that the senior officials in China did quietly import Western COVID vaccines and protected themselves. but the rest of the country is at risk. Now, whether or not that story is true, most Chinese believe it because they know they've been denied an effective COVID vaccine simply because the government wants to score points. The Chinese, by the way, were behind the efforts that came up about 20 years ago when Trump was starting with the rapidly developing an effective vaccine. They were the ones doing the hacking, trying to get in. Apparently, they didn't because they still haven't got as effective a COVID vaccine as the rest of the world. So they have that problem. Again, this is underway right now. The economy is slowing down. Their plans for surpassing the United States in GDP are on hold, really. I mean, the United States has its own problems with its, rising national debt, but the Chinese debt is even larger, and they are in much less of a position to pay it down. They have the banking crisis, the real estate crisis, as well as the shrinking population because of the working age population because of the one-child rule that started in 1980 and went on for about 30 years. So obviously that's a time bomb, which is still going off, and it'll be going off for another, a couple of decades. So if the Chinese were to attack Taiwan, aside from the difficulties, they would basically make their economic situation even worse because they would be cut off. Chinese shipping wouldn't get anywhere because they would basically be under a naval blockade. Even if we didn't basically go in and try and attack Chinese ports, their shipping wasn't going to reach China because they basically have few, ports that are not, blockadable. And the other problem with Taiwan is even if they took Taiwan, Taiwan has a lot of essential components they manufacture. And if those factories are destroyed or damaged, or the Taiwanese destroy them if they see they're losing, the Chinese are out of luck. The rest of the world is in a better position to replace those essential components. The Chinese have been hustling for years to accelerate their own production of the electronic chips and other components. They've done a few, but not enough. And we basically further limited their ability by stopping exports of fab equipment. These are the fabrication equipment for chips. So they can't manufacture a lot of chips, or at least it's going to take them longer. So the Chinese have a lot going against them if they try and attack. In other words, what's the point? The Taiwanese are going to put up a big fight. Xi Jinping, for example, recently said we must increase the readiness of our armed forces. Well, that's an understatement. They've been saying that for years. The Chinese have not fought a major war since Korea, and they did that to basically pay off a debt they owed to Russia. And when the armistice was signed after Stalin died, they basically told the Russians, our debt is paid. And of course, tellingly, the Russians have kept a disproportionate number of troops on the Chinese border, even with most of their troops from other areas, including the Norwegian border, where the Chinese troops guard the northern fleet bases. They've been withdrawn, sent into Ukraine, where they've been, chopped up. As the Norwegians describe it, they have villages of widows across the border now. I mean, they get a lot of information, from the across the border. So that's a pretty source of accurate intel. So the Chinese have every disincentive to attack Taiwan. Now, if somebody does attack Taiwan, it's a dynamic situation. The Taiwanese are rapidly improving their defenses, and the Chinese are desperately trying to become economically secure enough to withstand the blowback, the economic blowback, if they attack Taiwan. So what it comes down to is there's no rational reason right now and for the foreseeable future for the Chinese to attack. Now, it's a popular, what if to bounce around because it justifies, larger budgets for the not just the American Navy, but the South Korean and Japanese Navy. In fact, with the Japanese and South Korean fleets and much smaller contributions from other fleets in the area, that combined fleet is larger than the Chinese fleet. And of course, the Chinese fleet has not fought a war in a long time. Of course, neither of the Chinese or the South Koreans, but the Americans have. And we've been basically undertaking, vigorous naval operations, even without fighting, for over, since 40 years. It's after Vietnam, there was a lull, and now we're back at it. And of course, we're a victim of our own success in that department because we haven't got enough naval yards to do the necessary maintenance to keep all those ships going. So it's problems inside of problems inside of problems. Bottom line, nobody has a good incentive to go after Taiwan.
Austin?
I can't help but think back to a strategy talk Jim and I did. Of course, you hosted it, Dan, but about Ukraine. And Jim and I both agree that Russia didn't have any real, the disincentives Russia faced were huge. But I made the comment, you have to look at the map. And I'm being a plans officer or ops officer. And you have to look at the map and see what the opposition is doing. And you could see Russian forces, the satellite photos in Belarus there, and building up inside Russia, right on the Ukraine border, or behind on the east of the Donbass. I'm talking about the conventional forces. And sure enough, they went ahead, and Putin went ahead and did it. Why? Ultranationalism, and I think everybody knows he has sold himself on a myth of recreating a great Russian empire, because Russia is meant to be a world power and a great empire. And taking Ukraine, we've talked about it before, the Rubik, Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. I think Xi Jinping is doing it himself in China. You saw what happened with Hong Kong. Lots of disincentives to shutting Hong Kong, and they went ahead and did it. And the canary in the coal mine, there have been other canaries in the coal mine vis-a-vis the Chinese Communist Party. Taiwan, they're Xi and several other senior leaders in the Chinese Communist Party have sworn to recover. That's the way they present it. One China. And they are building military forces, building them up. They also intend to become the hegemon in Asia, and they are the Middle Kingdom. That's their active myth. China is going to become once again the Middle Kingdom, and to do that, they have to supplant the United States. But in the process of supplanting the United States, not only undermining the United States, they need to take Taiwan. So you're left then with as a responsible military officer saying, what do you do to on the ground to show China that they will pay a huge price, and perhaps they'll pay all the economic and political prices that Jim described, and have lots of domestic problems with it. But if the failure to take Taiwan, if they make them, does that topple the Chinese Communist Party? Maybe it does. So what you do is build up your forces and fortify Taiwan to the point that the sober elements in mainland China say, we really can't do it. So, in this week's column I wrote, I looked at a war game that CSIS sponsored, and I thought it was flawed for a number of reasons, the way they set it up. Nevertheless, some of their scenarios and the like, and they did a number of iterations at a large aggregation level. Their output was interesting, and I commented on some of it. One of the outputs is that China, in most scenarios, especially for the U.S., reacted quickly. Reacting quickly, Dan, means you got forces there. had enough naval ships to take losses. But if the United States reacted quickly, and Japan and South Korea were also involved, China fails. It's a disastrous situation for the global economy. It's a disaster Taiwan, and American and Japanese bases, U.S. bases throughout the Asian littoral and into the Western Pacific were absolutely devastated, destroyed by Chinese missile attacks. Now, just a quick sidebar on this. There's a book came out, 45 years ago, War Plan Orange, which the Naval Press. Excellent book. And it was about the orange was the code for the U.S. War with Japan. And it fits into with all the naval training that Alan Ophey wrote about to train the fleet. But in that, the author points out that the Army proposed, doing this on memory because I hadn't read the book in over 20 years, but at least twice to fortify Guam. And of course, we have the pressure. I do remember another element of that. The Army said we'd need to put 2 divisions, fortify it, and no one will ever take it, no one being the Japanese. It didn't happen. In a alternative history of World War II, think about what a thorn in the side of Imperial Japan, a Guam that's still holding out and fortified, would be if Guam hadn't fallen. But under the scenarios that the CSIS war game goes, it's Guam is overwhelmed with missile attacks, and I'm assuming also that maybe there's some air raids as well. Huge losses of American ships, American surface ships. One of the outputs, and I was looking at it again yesterday, was 2 carriers, lots of destroyers. One of the big successes out of it was U.S. submarines, and China loses loses a lot of its negative. But the other output they had on this, and this is just common sense, was turning Taiwan into a porcupine. Taiwan porcupine, meaning it can curl up and it has its bristles out and can withstand the Chinese attack. In order to do that, they've got to expand their armed forces, their ground forces, and they've got to dig in. I did point out that Taiwan is already has elements of being a super bunker. I saw some of them in 2002 when I was in Taiwan, and including I drove by. I didn't get a tour of it because it was off limits, but you could see this air base that had its hangars back carved into a mountain. If you think about it, similar way that the Swiss do it in their Alpine bastions. That was on this was on the eastern side of Taiwan, being very difficult to hit. And of course, the highway was structured so that it could be used as a airfield as well. The whole island needs to become that. And that was one of the recommendations by the CSIS wargaming team. These are necessary preparations. Why? Because China is making the necessary preparations, and you have to look at the map. I don't mean the map that's artificial and drawn, a map that's where you're building hardware and you're training soldiers and crewmen, and you're also conducting aggressive operations, as which the Chinese Air Force is, where they cross the median line, they go into the air defense identification zone of Taiwan all the time. Within the last week, they had one day where it was 19, and then the next day there were 21 communist Chinese aircraft penetrating. Of course, they're gaining electronic intelligence on how they're being monitored by the Taiwanese forces. Electronic intelligence is how they're being monitored by everybody else operating in the area, and also the Taiwanese reactions. One of the things that criticisms, and Jim commented on this, that Taiwan went through a period where it basically didn't add any new pilots. I think it was from like 2010, 2011 to 2019. Maybe they added 20, 21 new pilots or something like that. There's a pilot shortage. They know it. And they've also rebuilding their air forces as quickly as they can. It's going to take a while because they're buying the F-16 Viper version. Good, but they're not going to win it just with air power and missile power. They're going to have to if the Taiwanese are going to defeat a Taiwanese invasion. And by the way, Jim's right. There are 13 or 14 decent beaches. There are other places where you could land airborne forces if they could get in there, but Taiwan's a rock and limited beaches and limited beach capacity. But they have to be prepared to defend them. And why? Because China is building. It's not just a verbal and rhetorical threat. They're building forces designed for offensive war in the Asian littoral.
Well, that's all very interesting. Jim, did SPI ever do a game on the invasion of Taiwan?
No, because it was never a realistic, proposition. We did do, a war in the East, which was mainly about, Russia and China, which had a semi-active war. I mean, it was undeclared, but there were a lot of losses over a border dispute. And they finally settled that, but subsequently the Soviet Union fell apart. The Chinese have openly pointed out that they have studied what the Russians did in Ukraine, and they don't want to do the same thing. I mean, the Chinese have learned a lot from the mistakes of the Russians. They industrialized a lot quicker because, unlike the Russians, they didn't wait for the Russians didn't, waited for the Soviet Union to basically collapse before they really, accepted Western industrial methods. The Chinese basically, started a market economy, which took them a long way. But at the same time, they understood that a war would destroy a lot of their progress. Taiwan is basically not worth taking. Now, they also the Chinese noticed that the Russians thought, Ukraine really wasn't worth it for the Russians. I mean, that's obvious. I mean, they lost most of their army. It's going to take them years, probably a decade, to rebuild in any way, shape, or form. They got hit with enormous economic sanctions. The economic sanctions on China, if they attacked Taiwan, would be even larger. And unlike Putin, who is technically elected, but he's president for life because he changed the laws. If he gets removed or dies, whatever, then the war would probably sputter to an end. Because, the Russian people have a lot of forbearance, but they prefer prosperity over forbearance and, suffering, wartime poverty to support a war that doesn't even involve the invasion of Russian territory. I mean, that's something, Putin never was able to understand. Same thing with Taiwan. Yes, it'd be nice to have Taiwan back as the lost province, but at what cost? And the Chinese are a lot more pragmatic than the Russians. I mean, they looked at what the Russians, lost, as it were, going into Ukraine, and they realized they can do the math. And of course, the Chinese Communist Party hangs on to control in China only because they supply the Chinese people with an unprecedented level of affluence. They have a middle class with several 100 million people. Of course, the kicker on that, which they didn't realize, when they let loose, in the 1980s, when it's glorious to be rich, that was the catchphrase. that the more affluent families have fewer children. And there's no way to get around that. I mean, ask the South Koreans and the Japanese. Japanese population is shrinking. The women get, families get wealthier, and the woman says, I don't want this. The Japanese make it worse by treating women, terribly. Mothers, conditions in the obstetrics hospitals and whatnot. But that's another story. South Korea is suffering the same problem. Europe, it's even worse. The population is declining, and the Chinese are finding out that that is a back end, so to speak, of prosperity that they're also suffering. So the Chinese have always tended to be a little more wise. And Austin talked about eventually taking Taiwan. Yes, but the Chinese take the long view. They say, well, if we can't do it now, let's just wait a few decades, maybe a century or more, because time is on their side. Taiwan will get more prosperous, but at the same time, Taiwan may eventually see a more democratic China. It's not going to happen in our lifetimes, I don't think, in China, but it's something that will eventually happen because we've seen the demonstrations, not just Tiananmen, but since then there have been, a continuing agitation. Eventually the Taiwanese, if the Chinese become copacetic enough, even though right now the Taiwanese are very, united in maintaining their independence, that's simply because the alternative is being subjugated by a police state, which is what China still is. So things change over time. And of course, another thing to keep in mind about like the war plan Orange, one thing it sort of hints at that, but underestimated, was the impact of air power. When War Plan Orange was put together, the 1930s, they didn't realize how rapidly aircraft capabilities were growing in the 1930s. That was really a golden age, as it were, for advancements in aircraft. They went from biplanes to four-engine heavy bombers, in less than a decade. And that changed everything. And that meant that you could take an island, but you had to be able to supply it. And if the enemy had long-range aircraft, and the Japanese tried this during the war, but they didn't have enough of the long-range aircraft. In other words, the Japanese basically scrimped and saved for several decades to build up this huge fleet, but they couldn't replace it. Every aircraft they lost, every pilot they lost, they couldn't replace it. And that's why towards the end of the war, we have what they call the Marianas Turkey Shoot, where an enormous quantity of Japanese aircraft were sent into the air, but the pilots were not trained. They could produce the aircraft, but the pre-war pilots went through a strenuous training program. They had hundreds of hours, and they were superb in the early part of the war. And we realized it, and we developed tactics to mitigate their air superiority. And it didn't take more than a year or two before the Japanese had lost that air edge. And even during the Battle of Guadalcanal in 1943, the Japanese could not supply their troops on Guadalcanal. And of course, towards the end, the Japanese nicknamed Guadalcanal Starvation Island. So there's always the problem with supply. And of course, as Austin pointed out, with the ballistic missiles, non-nuclear ballistic missiles, these are much more difficult to intercept. It much complicates the problems of air defense. And in an initial, battles of any future war, you would have a hard time, maintaining your supply lines. And without those supply lines, especially to Taiwan doesn't feed itself. Nor could Japan during World War II. The nuclear weapons, a lot of people don't realize this. Without the nuclear weapons, there were two alternatives: a land invasion, which a lot of Americans were against. The war had been going on for over 3 years, and Americans have no patience for a war that lasts longer than 3 years. But the other alternative was a continuous blockade. We had basically submarines and aircraft dropping mines all around Japan to cut off their access to Manchuria, where they still could bring in food. So they were starving at the end of the war, and if that went on for another year, millions of Japanese would have starved. And given the attitude of the military government, which even tried to stop, Hirohito from, surrendering after the two atomic bomb drops. They were willing to sacrifice millions and millions of Japanese, for honor. Whenever somebody mentions honor at a war, you're going to have a high casualty count. And a lot of people don't like to believe that the A bombs, which were less, effective than the firebomb raids, but they were, one bomb, one aircraft. That was a scary proposition, and that basically scared them into accepting the unacceptable. As Hirohito, said on a radio broadcast, that's the first time an emperor had ever broadcast anything on the radio. But even while he was getting ready for that, his palace guard had to halt off another military coup to stop him from making that speech. So it's all about, what do we have to gain and what do we have to lose? And there are a lot of people in these countries that study history. The Chinese are particularly keen on it, more so than in the West. And they realize that, let's wait a century and see how it develops. And that's what you see them doing more and more. I mean, they'll rattle a saber, just to make the enemy nervous. But they realize if they can't control the South China Sea, which they won't be able to do in a war situation, they will starve. They have to import food as well. They have to import oil. They're very much in the same situation as Japan before World War II, and they're well aware of that. So, again, it depends on how much the combatants pay attention to history.
Austin, final
And I
words.
want to point out that Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin both toss the word honor around quite a bit, and they do. And look, I agree with Jim's analysis about the price China will pay, and I hope that there is a rational cadre in there with the power to stop. Can we call them the honor guys? I don't know. That's real honor is worth having. It's valuable. But it's pseudo honor where you go and attack and kill somebody. You end up putting yourself at risk. Sun Tzu points that out constantly. The latest annual threat assessment from the U.S. intelligence community says that one of their leadoff statements is that China wants to be able to deter the U.S. Taiwan Strait crisis by 2027. Andy Marshall in late 92, early 1993 had a think problem that he gave that one of the last things I heard him say was think about a war, a U.S. war for national survival between 2020 and 2025. And I said, you mean against China? And he says, that's right. And here we are, because he could see what William at the time was, of course, the director of the Net Assessments Office in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And we're here. And we've seen what the Chinese, let's call it the imperialist Chinese, are what they want. And you got to be prepared for it. So I'll leave it at that, Dan.
Okay, thanks. And I'm sure we'll talk about this again at some time in the future. Everybody have a great week. Bye.
Bye.